Of course, once again, you need to write or type in three major items, but try just to have one for each of the three branches, and preferably something you didn't know before or something you haven't written in the participation before. But let's start with the legislative branch, and of course, that's made up of Congress. As we mentioned, the bell ringer, that would be a bicameral legislature, so two parts, the Senate and the House. The House of Representatives is known as the lower house and has 435 members. And these 435 members choose their leader, which is called the Speaker. And the Speaker of the House currently is Nancy Pelosi of California. This is the second time she's been Speaker of the House. The House of Representatives is incredibly large. And so, since it has so many people, kind of like the assembly in Athens, where everybody could come from the town and vote, that means that it's much more difficult to have order. And so they have a lot more rules than the Senate. Their rule book is probably 2 to 3 times longer. And they also limit the amount of activity that can happen. So not anybody can just speak. Each party is allotted for 1 hour of speaking time after each piece of legislation. And then the party breaks that up into 5 or 1 minute segments. So they really limit the amount of speaking that can happen throughout the House of Representatives. Otherwise, 435 people would just be too chaotic. They also much more often rely on the committee system, where they break apart into groups and focus on specific topics. Like there's a committee on armed services or the military, there's a committee on agriculture, there's a committee on science, and so on. And they concentrate on the bills that are proposed, basically, and they're basically put into a filter system where they go to the correct committee that they have something to do with, and that committee then investigates and researches the bill to see if it's good. Most legislation dies at the committee level because obviously there are a lot of bills that aren't that great, or they're redundant, or maybe they won't get any support anywhere. And so many of those bills happen to die in committee. The committee chair people, of course, are the most important, and usually they're the most senior person on each of those committees. So in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, you gaining a number of years under your belt is important to the level of power that you have. The Speaker of the House is obviously going to be from the majority party. So whoever has the most seats out of the two parties, that's who the Speaker is probably going to be. In the case right now, it's of course the Democrats, and they've elected a Democrat, Nancy Pelosi, to do that. If the Republicans were to take the majority, which according to the polls is unlikely, they would choose their own person to put on the ballot to be Speaker, and of course they would have more votes and they would choose them instead. But besides the Speaker, the House also has a majority leader and a minority leader, people that basically lead their party meetings to decide how they should support specific pieces of legislation. And they also have what are called whips. Whip is someone who helps the party and goes around and talks to each of their individual members saying, hey, are you going to vote yes for this? Just to make sure that everybody's on the same page for bills. The House of Representatives has and always had 435 people. The last time they increased it was in the first half of the 20th century, and it's really up to them. They can increase the number of members, which probably some critics say should happen because now they're up to about one representative for every 700,000 people, which is the highest it's ever been. In the past, there's been less than 100,000 people for each representative, so they should probably double or maybe even triple the size of the House of Representatives. Just in contrast, Great Britain has a much smaller population than the United States, but they have over 600 people in the House of Commons. So a lot of people think that that number should increase. Of course, House members aren't going to necessarily vote for that because if you're one of 435, that's much better than being one out of 600. So there's a disincentive for them to try to change that. Then, of course, there's the Senate, which is 2 senators, of course, for each of the 50 states for a total of 100. They are ceremonially led by the Vice President of the United States. When he's in the Senate chamber, he's called Mr. President. And they also have a backup one, which is the most senior member of the majority party, which is called the President Pro Tempore, which is spelled Tempore. But the person with the most power, they also have this system in the Senate, is going to be the majority leader. They're the ones that put various chair people into their own committees and help establish the rules and decide how the calendar of business is going to work in the Senate. And with only 100 people, it's much easier to control. So they only have a very small rule book, and they often allow an enormous amount of speaking time. It takes 60 senators right now to vote for someone to stop speaking. So it is possible for someone to continually speak just to stop the calendar of business in what's called a filibuster. The senators also have a number of other things they could do. They could individually stop certain nominations from happening or bills from being passed. But some have been critical of that because they don't think it's right for just one senator or a small group of senators to have so much power. The United States Senate, as we mentioned with the checks and balances, they have specific powers, specifically watching over or approving things that the president does. Then there's the executive branch. The president of the United States and the vice president of the United States obviously make up this. They are elected for 4-year terms, and they can do that twice according to the 22nd Amendment. There are no term limits on Congress, by the way. The Supreme Court has ruled that's unconstitutional without an amendment to the Constitution. But anyway, the executive branch is much bigger than those two because assisting the president would be the cabinet. These are the department heads that are usually known as secretaries, except for the Justice Department, which is called an attorney general. And they are in charge of these very big departments that often employ tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that help administer the policies passed by Congress. The Defense Department is the biggest, and it obviously includes the United States military, but also a massive amount of civilians that help run the bases and maintain them, for instance, and help take care of the troops. And the newest of the cabinet departments would be Homeland Security, which was just established under 9/11, which helps coordinate our security matters for the United States inside our own borders. The 15 cabinet departments, the three most powerful, one would be defense that I just mentioned, the State Department, which is in charge of foreign affairs, and then the Treasury Department, which is obviously in charge of money. The Attorney General's office and the judicial branch, of course, are controversial sometimes because the Attorney General is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, but they're also the one in charge of making sure that nobody breaks the law, including the president. So some people have been critical that, of course, isn't going to happen if the Attorney General and the president are the same party. And the executive branch also includes over 1 million employees, closer to 2 million, and most of them are hired through what is called the civil service system. This system sets up a merit-based system and testing to make sure that they're hired because of the merit, because they deserve the job, not because of who they're friends with. This is a change from before the 1870s when there used to be a thing called the spoil system, when that's how everyone was hired. Everyone was hired based on who you knew, which meant a lot of people couldn't do the jobs right, and there was an incredible amount of corruption. But that changed with the introduction of the civil service. And the last of the three branches would be the judicial branch. The judicial branch is very sparse in description in the third article of the Constitution. What it does say is there's a superior court and then inferior courts made by Congress. The Supreme Court doesn't even have a number of people listed in the Constitution, so that's up to Congress. And over the last century or so, actually going back to the middle of the last one, they established 9 justices as the traditional amount on the Supreme Court. These 9 justices are led by a chief justice, and besides just presiding and gaveling in the meetings, he also administers the court and decides what part of the country the associate justices should watch over. And then he also writes up a report yearly for Congress about the needs of the judicial branch. The other courts include, underneath the Supreme Court, are the courts of appeal, which are spread throughout the country into different regions. They rehear original cases to see if they've met the needs of the Constitution. And the lower courts are where most of the action happens. The federal district courts are the individual courtrooms where there's just one judge and a defense attorney and a prosecutor and a jury, and basically the same kind of trials that you see on TV, but they're just at the federal level involving federal crimes. So that's the basic makeup of the 3 branches. So if you haven't already, make sure that you've put in 3 items into daily participation, preferably about each of those branches.